Hello, potential friends and adventurers. I'm M, and today we have quite a special occasion. Review of Bliaron 2nd edition, setting and role-playing system. Welcome to the DM table. This is an unsponsored review. The author did contact me and asked me to do a review, but me not having prior knowledge of Bliaron, I didn't immediately agree. Rather, we came to an agreement that I could look at it and think about it and see whether it's fitting to the channel, whether I would want to review it. It was completely freely up to me whether I would want to or not, and I could just as well leave it and not say anything. So yes, I am reviewing it. So let's see how it went. Bliaron 2nd edition is, at first glance, quite a hefty book at over 230 pages, but very few of those are actually pages describing rules, because it's not a very rules-heavy system at all. You could, at a glance, call it rules light, but it does have some requirements. So, what is in all those other pages? Well, Bliaron 2nd edition brings us quite a lot of things amongst its pages. Firstly, you can immediately notice that from the cover, from the illustrations, the design is wonderful and it looks very well put together. It evokes the kind of feeling of Bronze Age sword and sorcery, and the style that was popular in the old role-playing books. It reminds me both of older GURPS books. I have some on Magic that have similar illustrations, and also of the old comic books of Conan and such. To any sword and sorcery fans, this will feel right at home, and the quality is pretty good, as I said. Illustrations really keep to the theme, they're pretty consistent, they really evoke that feel. The book is presented, generally speaking, in a pretty slick and trim manner, where it almost doesn't feel like you're reading a rule book. It almost feels like you're reading a novel. At most times it's actually fun to read, which I wouldn't say for most role-playing manuals per se at default, if you get over the first excitement that you're reading a role-playing manual when you're new. So that's really well done. And also, one other thing that's really wonderful is that it has incredibly, non-biased depictions of its factions. You wouldn't even know, even if you're a DM, even if you read the whole thing, you won't know who really is at the end on top of whom, who's better from which faction, who's more good, who's less good, who's more evil, and so on and so forth. It's a really detailed setting, yet incredibly enough, it opens almost all of its factions to interpretation, and never tells you how to play. Well, it never really tells you how you should play, but it does really also have wonderful DM and player advice in it, which I'll come to later to describe, because it's really one of the highlights, quite so. So, we have lots of setting info, we have lots of lore, we have lots to immerse ourselves in. We can read about continent of Bliaron remaining in a post-apocalyptic state after the fall of an ancient magical civilization that reached very technical heights of magic use and had perhaps maybe a moderner society, but I wouldn't know. We just know that it had a highly complex magical society that controlled almost every aspect of reality around them, so much so that the survivors now consider it a godlike civilization, where each and every member was like a god to them. And yet not much has survived, not much is known, only some traditions and some influences, very few customs, very few cultural remnants, very few intact buildings and cities, and yet they do dot the landscape, offering dungeons and so on. And yet this is very classical Bronze Age type of setting. You won't find modern machines or such. Mostly you'll find magic and remnants of magical items and artifacts. It is really reminiscent of the Conan and Hyborian age, and yet you get unique setting with very well described, well, new, unique age, if you will. It's not a parallel plane of Earth, as far as I can tell. It seems to be happening on its own planet, and you'll have so much new lore to uncover, so much new things to read. And I'm not usually one to really at all use modules or bot stuff for making my campaigns, but this is so well endowed with depth that I wanted a Bliaron novel whilst I was reading it. I really wanted to see what happens next. It was interesting enough to garner further imagination from the get-go and give much more desire to explore than just some pre-packed quests or settings would have you have. So really well done on that. For example, at current moment, what we have is that one of the people from the old civilization has risen and has unified some barbarians and families of the north, and they now have a living god king among them with inscrutable motives that, it will be up to you as a DM to figure out and try to see what you can see. Otherwise, on the continent, you have mostly majorcratic government, mages that have formed a ruling body over several cities of great importance on the continent, mostly on the south end, where the now formed northern rule does not reach. They are worried about the current developments because there is a huge, powerful country in the north that they do not know the purposes of. Certainly not of their leader, at the very least, and the war might be brewing. Otherwise, there's very many tribes and villages and so on in the, essentially borderlands of the whole region, minding their own business. Being in jungles, in deserts, in mountains, everywhere, and everyone has their own customs and beliefs, faiths, culture. It's all really pretty much open to have interesting lines of play with your players about any sort of philosophy or shamanic customs or spiritualism, and it gives quite a bit of good advice on how to run a spiritualism-orientated campaign. It also gives lots of examples of NPCs. It sort of teaches you how to run this sort of thing, even if you haven't before. But especially if you do have some experience as a DM, this really shows itself for what kind of treasure it is for developing further your abilities in running such a setting, or such settings in general. It's really great for that. It does have lots of freedom to do what you want, and it shows how much physics and so on will be more subject to the whims of the spirits, the atmosphere of the region, the auras, all kinds of natural energies and happenings that are happening in the surroundings. And so you'll be able to think up all kinds of things that you would want to concentrate on, and many other things that can happen. It's one of those anything can happen in the wasteland type of deals. You have that on top of a great setting. And not only that, really, you could run almost any kind of character in this, even if you don't use the original setting, or even if you do, because by default rules you could play quite a successful merchant, for example, or you could be a explorer, or anything really that comes to players' mind when facing with a setting. I mentioned the merchant because there's a nice bartering tiered system. Then there's also regular money system, so you can combine them how you wish, and trading ends up being interesting and fun, which I didn't expect it to be because I usually don't try to play a merchant. I know some people have fun with that, so this would probably be their thing. And also you get some instructions on how to have your players potentially be members of these factions and organizations, especially the Sahin, the mages organization that acts as government, that sort of prescribes how magic should be treated, how dangerous it might be outside of control, and also teaches new wizards, I suppose. And so you can have your young player characters be part of that as new apprentices or even as apprentices in study. So you can have kind of sword and sorcery, not really Harry Potter, but almost if you wanted to. Or you can have something quite else. But it does teach you of these factions, their customs and command structures so that you can run the kind of campaign you want, within or without. As I said before, there is ample DM advice, but it's sort of, well, it's unique. It's unique to this book. It's some of the better DM advice I have ever read as well, and I've read several books on DM advice over the years, and here you have some excellent advice. Even so much that it has player advice that gives some advanced tips on how players can help the campaign run better, how they can help the DM run better, how they can help run a little bit by themselves, how it all sort of mixes together wonderfully. Well, it's just such excellent player advice. So yeah, this is where I'm just as impressed as with the setting, maybe even more. However, Bliaron does have one challenge, and potentially it still might have one flaw, but we'll see whether it still does or doesn't. The challenge of Bliaron is that even if system is simple at first glance, where you have your several attributes, where you have each one of them represent a sort of a both primary attribute like strength or intelligence, and then also represent the force of nature like strength or mind, thought. Each of them has its own die pool, and you simply set your difficulty and roll against it using d10s, and so on and so forth. Not very many rules there, but what it sort of requires you to do is to master the magic building mechanism. It's not just magic building, it's not spell making only. It's make your own move, it's make your own class move, it's literally make all of your moves and therefore make the class, because whilst the book supports very well being a basic wizard, and I guess in D&D terms you would say priest as well, because they can heal if they study to do so, for anything else you would need to develop your moves. For any supernatural feat, for any sort of thing, you would need to use the system to make your whole line of moves. But on the other hand, that's great. At least I like it enough if you really want your players to make their own moves whenever they would need to learn one. Or you can make some that they could learn as a DM. Or you could make all of the ones that they would learn as a DM. In any case, it's something that's researched, that's studied. Bliaron is made so that it feels that magic is being researched again, that it's dawn of magical science, where barely people are transitioning from a tribal age into an age of antique enlightenment, and their magic is becoming more researched. This is the feel that your players will get when developing their fighter moves, their monk moves, where they'll be making anything really that they need unless you as a DM make it for them. But the system should be good enough to do this without too much trouble. However, Bliaron 2nd edition really respects your intelligence, which is to say that it expects you to read the examples, and there's quite a few examples of spells and so on, where you would just from points invested and keywords understand the whole background and story and beliefs associated with that spell. The system is sufficient enough to do this well enough, but It really requires some level of mastery to really do this well, I suppose. But also expect to be working with your imagination all the time, needing to project into how the attack looks, how does it feel, how does it work in the world. However, Bliaron also states that it is very forgiving, and essentially because spirits could have at the time interfered, magic could have been more wild at the location, things could have misfired, things could have been not very well understood and researched yet, and so one iteration of a spell is not necessarily like the next if it sort of gets somewhat miscast, whether by the player or even by the misunderstanding DM's, well, interpretation and therefore interaction with the environment, with the world, with the field in which the spell was cast. So in that case, you sort of can pick it up and try again, and maybe it'll get consistenter. In fact, it's supposed to get somewhat consistenter as you learn along. But as such, it is an excellent, perhaps generic system for move making. You could run almost anything on Bliaron. You could well enough run Dragon Ball, and I think it would work. I haven't tested it that far, but I think you could run almost any sort of thing by just customizing the moves for the setting each time. In fact, Bliaron has rules for switching systems in the middle of play due to altering the reality of the setting. And they're serious enough. They're not like one other thing that I heard of. No, this is so where it's directly hinted that Bliaron can be an excellent setting book even if you decide to not use its system, so this is not as big of a problem if you don't want to. You can just use it as a source for a setting. On the other hand, you could also not choose to use the setting if for some reason you didn't want to play it, and you could play something else with the system and it would work well. So that's kind of the dual use of Bliaron 2nd edition, and it's outright clearly stated and achievable. Now for that drawback. So that one flaw is that the English language in the book is not always, well, not perfectly clear or written as intended, so, well, it wasn't natively written in English, not that that should prevent anybody, but still, if you're not the sort of person to look down at an indie system for this sort of thing, then you probably shouldn't too much here as well. But what's really, really amazing is that author really listens. I have, well, I guess in hopes of helping, wrote quite a bit about where were the mistakes and so on after reading the whole book, and fixed up quite a few things and so on and so forth, and even caught some wrong damage in some spells and stuff like that, and some beta remains or something from some arrow stats and so on and so forth, and amazingly enough, the author says that they will fix it. They'll make an updated version and you'll be able to get the fixed version, and maybe the flaw won't be there. There's also some descriptions that I felt of examples that were a bit lacking, and those fall under this category, and I've suggested some slight elaborations here and there, and maybe we'll get that too. In any case, it really sounded like everything will get fixed with great care and attention. I've gotten to discuss back and forth flavor of certain spells and why they're like that and so on and so forth with the author, and yes, that this is the level at which we can expect the author's attention to be towards what is good for the game, so you may get completely fixed version and not even worry about that. So you can check when that is later. It's I don't think it's known now when that'll be, maybe by this point, I don't know when you're watching the video, but that's the case, and I'm really happy about it. I just worried that I was too annoying, and I hope I wasn't, and I hope my tone was okay, and so on and so forth, so that the author didn't feel horrible. I know that I sometimes take flaws of my work to heart, so I hope that this wasn't something that happened, and so yeah, that's my Bliaron review. And what do I say about Bliaron Second Edition? If you're a fan of sword and sorcery and you want a whole new Hyborian age to explore with your players or yourself with the DM, then this is probably for you, really. Some people were mourning the lack of this sort of thing and this sort of style, this sort of art, and well, there's a whole huge book of this now. And also otherwise, if you want a very hands-on but very generic system that will really get you far in role-playing, if you want to port it to many a thing without too much trouble but with lots of mastery, that's also all yours if you get it, completely separate from the setting, if you will. So that's there as well. And as a result, really good, really good. Some more clarity, some more direct usage of language would be welcome, but other than that, that's how it went. That's Bliaron Second Edition, and I overall liked it very much, and can recommend it for the purposes stated. So, adventure, if you thought this was unique, or at least in this case, that Bliaron Second Edition was nice, maybe you can spare me a click and I could see you here next and every week. I wish you luck on your adventures. Bye.